If you were a boatman working the River Thames on a moonless night in the 1750s, you might have seen something that would make you question your sanity. You would be drifting past the ruins of Medmenham Abbey, a crumbling, abandoned monastery near Marlow. And there, cutting through the fog, you would see a barge. On the barge, silent and motionless, sat 12 figures dressed in the heavy, woolen robes of Franciscan monks. They didn't speak, they didn't row, they just drifted toward the abbey, disappearing into the shadows of the Watergate, beneath an archway carved with a single, unsettling command: silence. It looks like the start of a horror movie. It looks like a gathering of dark sorcerers preparing to summon a demon. But if you could have pulled back the hood of one of those monks, you wouldn't have found a warlock. You would have found John Montague, the Earl of Sandwich, and the First Lord of the Admiralty. Pull back another hood and you'd find Thomas Potter, the Paymaster General. Pull back a third, and you'd find Sir Francis Dashwood, the future Chancellor of the Exchequer. This wasn't a coven. It was, effectively, the British cabinet in drag. Tonight, we are talking about the Hellfire Club. It is one of history's great ghost stories, a tale of Satanism, orgies, and black magic practiced by the most powerful men in the British Empire. But the reality of the Hellfire Club isn't about magic. It is about something far more relatable and far more human: boredom. Specifically, the crushing existential boredom of being rich, powerful, and male in the 18th century. To understand why these men were dressing up as monks and drinking wine out of skulls, you have to understand the era they lived in. This was the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. London in the mid-17th century was a place of aggressive rationality. Science was dismantling superstition. Commerce was replacing feudalism. The world was being categorized, labeled, and put into neat little boxes. For a certain type of aristocrat, this rationality was suffocating. If you were Sir Francis Dashwood, the founder of the club, you didn't want reason. You wanted theater. You wanted mystery. You wanted to feel something other than the polite ennui of a tea salon. Dashwood is the key to this whole operation. He wasn't a dark, brooding villain. By all accounts, he was a traveler, an aesthete, and a man with a very expensive sense of humor. As a young man, he had gone on the Grand Tour of Europe, the 18th century equivalent of a gap year for billionaires. He traveled through Italy and France, visiting the great Catholic cathedrals. But while most tourists were admiring the architecture, Dashwood was fascinated by the ritual. The incense, the robes, the chanting, the mystery. As a staunch Protestant, he found the theology ridiculous, but he loved the aesthetic. He looked at the pomp of the Vatican and thought, I want that, but I want it to be a joke. So he created the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wycombe. Note that they never actually called themselves the Hellfire Club. That was a name given to them later by the press. To themselves, they were just the Friars. In 1751, Dashwood leased Medmenham Abbey. It was a genuine 12th century Cistercian ruin, but for Dashwood, it wasn't ruined enough. He spent a fortune hiring architects to renovate the abbey, but not to fix it. He paid them to make it look more Gothic. He built a ruined tower that served no purpose other than to look spooky in the moonlight. He installed stained glass windows, but instead of depicting the Virgin Mary or the Apostles, the glass depicted the 12 apostles of the club, his drinking buddies dressed as kings and pontiffs. The centerpiece of the renovation was the motto carved above the main door, Fais ce que tu voudras, do what thou wilt. Later, occultists like Aleister Crowley would steal this phrase and make it sound terrifyingly magical, but Dashwood stole it first. He took it from Rabelais, the French satirist. In Rabelais' stories, the Abbey of Theleme is a utopia where the only rule is that everyone is free to pursue their own pleasure. And that was the ideology of the club. It wasn't Satanism. It was libertarian hedonism wrapped in a layer of very high-budget cosplay. The grounds of the Abbey were designed as a sort of sexual theme park for the intellectual elite. Dashwood laid out the gardens with obsessive detail. On the surface, it looked like a standard English country garden, rolling lawns, Grecian statues, tasteful fountains. But if you knew what you were looking for, the whole garden was a dirty joke. The layout was designed to mimic the female form. There were caves positioned anatomically. There were statues of pagan fertility gods hidden in the bushes. There was a statue of Harpocrates, the god of silence, pressing a finger to his lips, reminding the members that what happens at medmenham stays at medmenham. The club had 2 chapters of membership. You had the Superior Order, the 12 Apostles. These were the heavy hitters, the politicians, the poets, the artists. Then you had the Inferior Order, guests, friends, and hangers-on who were allowed to come to the parties but weren't allowed in the inner sanctum. So, what actually happened when the boat docked and the monks went inside? If you believe the Victorian rumors that came later, they were slaughtering babies and summoning Lucifer. But if you look at the wine receipts, and we do have the wine receipts, they were mostly just getting incredibly drunk. The primary activity of the Hellfire Club was dining. They ate massive gluttonous meals. They drank claret by the barrel, and they engaged in what they called the rites. These rites were elaborate parodies of Catholic Mass. Dashwood would dress as the abbot. The other members would dress as friars. They would sing hymns, but the lyrics were rewritten to be about sex and wine. They would deliver sermons that were obscene satires of British politics. It was essentially a frat house for men who ran the world. But there was a darker, or at least seedier, element to it. The nuns. The records refer to nuns present at the meetings. These were not female aristocrats. These were women brought in from the London brothels, dressed in habits and paid to participate in the rituals. This is where the Drowsy lens helps us see the sadder truth of the place. We tend to romanticize the Hellfire Club as this powerful, mystical gathering. But in reality, it was a room full of middle-aged men bloated with gout and port wine, paying women to pretend to be nuns so they could feel a momentary thrill of transgression. It was transactional. It was manufactured. It was a desperate attempt to feel naughty in a world that had become too safe, too predictable, and too ruled by logic. For a few years it worked. The boatmen on the Thames kept their distance, the locals whispered about ghosts in the Abbey. Dashwood and his friends managed to create a private world where the laws of England didn't apply. But you can only mix alcohol, politics, and secrecy for so long before the mixture becomes volatile. The club had a strict rule of brotherhood. Inside the Abbey, political enemies were supposed to be friends. The Earl of Sandwich, a corrupt conservative, and John Wilkes, a radical, progressive, drank from the same cup. They laughed at the same blasphemous jokes. But outside the Abbey, the political situation in Britain was heating up, and the tension inside the cave was building. Dashwood had built a playground for the elite, assuming that gentlemen could always keep a secret. He forgot that gentlemen are also petty, vindictive, and prone to holding grudges. And the grudge between the Earl of Sandwich and John Wilkes was about to blow the roof off the Abbey, with a little help from a baboon in a costume. Part 2. The Baboon and the Devil. If you want to understand the Hellfire Club, not the legend, but the actual dynamic in the room, you have to look at the two men who eventually destroyed it. In one corner, wearing the robes of a monk, you have John Montague, the fourth Earl of Sandwich. Yes, that sandwich. The man who allegedly invented the snack because he was too addicted to gambling to leave the card table for dinner. Sandwich was a piece of work. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty, meaning he controlled the Royal Navy. He was incompetent, notoriously corrupt, and universally disliked. One contemporary described him as having a face like a half-hanged man. He was the establishment personified, cruel, powerful, and arrogant. In the other corner you have John Wilkes. Wilkes was chaos energy. He was a radical journalist, a member of parliament, and a man so ugly that he openly bragged about it. He used to say that it took him half an hour to talk away his face, meaning that within 30 minutes of conversation, his charm would make you forget what he looked like. And it worked. Wilkes was funny, dangerous, and hated everything Sandwich stood for. He was the populist hero of the London mob, shouting about liberty and freedom of the press. It is a miracle they didn't kill each other in Parliament, but in the Hellfire Club, they were brothers. They were supposed to leave their politics at the door and bond over the shared hobby of blasphemy. But Wilkes was the kind of guy who couldn't resist a prank. And he knew that Sandwich, despite all his posturing as a cynical rake, was actually a bit nervous about the supernatural. Sandwich wanted to mock the devil, but he was terrified that the devil might actually show up. And that brings us to the most famous story in the history of the club. The date is disputed, but let's place it around the late 1750s. The friars are gathered in the great hall of Medmenham Abbey. The mood is heavy, the wine is flowing, the candlelight is flickering against the stained glass. Sir Francis Dashwood is leading the ritual. He is chanting in Latin, probably bad Latin, invoking the spirits of the underworld. The Earl of Sandwich is sitting there, wrapped, maybe a little drunk, maybe a little too invested in the spooky atmosphere. Wilkes is watching him. And Wilkes has prepared a surprise. Earlier that day, Wilkes had smuggled a chest into the abbey. Inside the chest was a baboon. A live, angry, confused baboon that Wilkes had dressed in a little costume, a cape, horns, the full demonic ensemble. At the climax of the ritual, just as Dashwood is shouting some invocation to Satan, Wilkes pulls a rope attached to the chest. The lid flies open. The baboon springs out. Now, imagine the scene. You are drunk. The room is dark. You have been chanting for an hour about summoning a demon. And suddenly, a hairy, horned, screaming creature leaps onto your table. The baboon, terrified by the noise, jumps straight onto the shoulder of the Earl of Sandwich. Sandwich doesn't think, a primate in a costume. Sandwich thinks, it worked. We actually did it. My soul is forfeit. The First Lord of the Admiralty, the man in charge of the British Navy, reportedly falls to his knees in front of the monkey. He starts screaming, begging for mercy. The legend says he shouted, "Spare me, O devil! I'm not half as bad as I pretended. I never truly sinned. It was all talk." He is confessing. He is weeping. He is trying to plea bargain with a monkey. Meanwhile, the baboon is screeching. The other monks are scrambling. And John Wilkes is presumably laughing so hard he can't breathe. Eventually, someone catches the poor animal. They pull off the costume. Sandwich realizes he has been begging for his life from a pet. The humiliation was absolute. Sandwich never forgave Wilkes. The brotherhood was broken. The joke of the Hellfire Club The idea that they were all in on it together evaporated. Sandwich decided to destroy Wilkes. He waited for his moment, and when Wilkes eventually published a particularly obscene poem, an essay on woman, which was essentially a pornographic parody of Alexander Pope, Sandwich stood up in the House of Lords and read it aloud to the shock and horror of the government. He branded Wilkes a blasphemer and a libertine, using the very activities they had done together in the cave as evidence against him. It was supreme hypocrisy. It was the pot calling the kettle black, except the pot was also trying to have the kettle hanged for treason. Wilkes was expelled from Parliament. He had to flee to France. The Hellfire Club was exposed. The public was scandalized, but not for the reasons Dashwood expected. The public didn't care about the theology. They cared about the politics. Rumors started flying. People said that the Prime Minister, Lord Bute, was a member. He likely was. They said that British policy was being decided during black masses. This is where the Hellfire myth really takes off. The reality, middle-aged men playing dress-up, was boring. The rumor that the government was a satanic cabal was electric. Dashwood realized the game was up. Medmenham Abbey was too public. The boatmen were watching. The journalists were sniffing around. The secret was out. But Dashwood wasn't ready to give up. He still had the itch. He still needed his sanctuary. So he decided to move the club. But he didn't move it to another house. He moved it underground in his family estate at West Wycombe. There was a hill, and under that hill there was a chalk mine. Dashwood hired local villagers who were suffering from a harvest failure and needed the work to dig. He paid them to carve a labyrinth into the hill. These are the Hellfire caves that you can still visit today, and they are a masterpiece of atmospheric design. They extend 1/4 mile underground. Dashwood designed them symbolically. You enter through a Gothic archway that looks like the mouth of a church. You walk down a long, winding tunnel representing the descent into the underworld. The tunnels are narrow. The walls are rough white chalk. It is cold down there, even in summer. He dug specific rooms: the Steward's Cave, the Whitehead's Cave, and deep in the earth, he dug a river Styx. He actually diverted a subterranean stream so that it flowed across the path. To get to the final room, the inner temple, you had to get into a small boat and be ferried across the water, like a soul crossing into Hades. It was immersive theater. It was Disney World for depraved aristocrats. But by the time the caves were finished in the 1760s, the energy was gone. The Sandwich-Wilkes feud had soured everything. The members were getting older. Dashwood himself was becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer, a job that required a lot of math and very little wizardry. The meetings in the caves became less frequent. The rituals became half-hearted. There is something incredibly melancholic about the image of Dashwood, now an old man sitting in a cold chalk cave, staring at a fake river, waiting for friends who were too busy or too famous to show up. The magic trick had failed. The rationality of the outside world had won. But just as the club was dying out, a new figure entered the orbit. A man who adds a whole new layer of conspiracy to the story. Benjamin Franklin. Yes, the founding father with the kite and the key. Franklin was in London during this period serving as a colonial agent. He was a close friend of Sir Francis Dashwood. They actually wrote a prayer book together, a sort of deist liturgy for rational men. Franklin stayed at West Wycombe many times. We know he visited the caves. The question that has obsessed historians for 2 centuries is, did he join? Was Benjamin Franklin the face of American prudence down in the chalk mines wearing a monk's robe and chanting to Bacchus?
Or was he doing something else? Remember, Franklin was a spy. Or at least he was a diplomat operating in enemy territory as the American Revolution approached. The Hellfire Club was a gathering of the most powerful men in the British government. If you wanted to know what the First Lord of the Admiralty was planning for the Navy, where better to ask him than in a cave when he's 6 glasses of wine deep? It is entirely possible that the Hellfire Club wasn't just a party for Franklin. It was an intelligence operation. But whether he joined or just watched, Franklin's presence signals the end of an era. The world was changing. Revolution was coming both in America and in France. The age of aristocratic play acting was ending. The age of guillotine and gunpowder was beginning. The caves fell silent. The torches were put out. The monks went back to their estates to die of gout or old age. And the legend should have ended there. But legends are like weeds. They grow best in ruins. The party, inevitably, had to end. That is the tragedy of all secret societies. They rely on momentum. They rely on the collective delusion that what is happening inside the room is more important than what is happening outside. But the outside world always wins. By the 1770s, the Brotherhood was dead. The political infighting had scattered the members. John Wilkes was a revolutionary hero in exile. The Earl of Sandwich was busy mismanaging the British Navy into losing the American colonies. And Sir Francis Dashwood was just an old man, wandering his beautiful, empty gardens, watching the weeds start to reclaim the statues. Dashwood died in 1781, and almost immediately, the truth died with him. This is where the history of the Hellfire Club gets hijacked. You see, the 18th century was a time of excess wit and cynicism. But the 19th century, the Victorian era, was different. The Victorians were moralists. They were obsessed with propriety, virtue, and clear lines between good and evil. When Victorian historians looked back at the Hellfire Club, they couldn't understand it. They couldn't process the idea that the Chancellor of the Exchequer would dress up as a monk just for a laugh. It didn't fit their worldview. So they rewrote it. They decided that if these men were meeting in caves, they must have been doing something truly diabolical. The Victorians took the rumors and cemented them as fact. They invented the stories of actual demon summoning. They claimed the nuns were kidnapped virgins. They weren't. They turned a drinking club into a Gothic horror story. Why? Because it's comforting. It is easier to believe that your leaders are evil than to believe that they are just bored. Evil implies a plan. Evil implies that the world has a structure, even if it's a dark one. But boredom? Boredom is chaotic. Boredom means the men in charge are just as lost as the rest of us. So the legend of the Hellfire Club became a kind of cautionary tale. It became the satanic panic of the 1800s. But if you want to find the real ghost of the Hellfire Club, you don't look in the history books. You have to go back to the hill. If you drive out to West Wycombe today, the village is still there. It's a sleepy, picturesque English town. And looming over it is the Golden Ball, a massive hollow gold sphere that Dashwood built on top of the church tower, where he and his friends used to sit and drink, literally looking down on the peasants below. But the real attraction is underneath.
You can buy a ticket, you can walk through the Gothic archway, and you can step into the Hellfire Caves. I want you to picture the sensory experience of this place. The first thing that hits you is the temperature. It is a constant, damp chill. It doesn't matter if it's a scorching July day outside. Inside the hill, it is always the temperature of a tomb. The walls are chalk, pure stark white. It feels like you are walking inside the ribcage of a leviathan. The tunnels wind and twist, deliberately confusing, dug by hand by men holding candles in the 1750s. As you walk deeper, you pass the nooks, the little alcoves where the wine was stored, where the arguments happened, where the laughter once echoed. Now they are just holes in the rock. You reach the banqueting hall, a massive circular chamber deep underground. This is the heart of the club. This is where the baboon jumped on the Earl of Sandwich. This is where the government of Great Britain once sat in robes, toasting to liberty and love. It is empty now. There is no furniture, no tapestries, just the damp white walls and the sound of your own breathing. And then you reach the end. The river Styx. Dashwood's artificial river is still there, though the water level is lower now. You can see the inner temple across the gap. Standing there, in the silence, you don't feel fear. You don't feel the presence of the devil. You feel melancholy. You realize the immense effort that went into this. Dashwood spent a fortune digging these holes. He spent years designing the costumes, writing the rituals, building the myth. He was trying so hard to manufacture magic. He was trying to create a space where the rules of reality didn't apply. And looking at the cold, empty chalk, you realize that it was all just a desperate attempt to escape the crushing weight of the ordinary. We all do this in our own ways. We don't dig caves or dress as monks, usually, but we doom scroll, we binge watch, we play video games, we lose ourselves in conspiracy theories. We are constantly looking for a Hellfire club, a place where we can take off the mask of our daily responsibilities and be something else. Sir Francis Dashwood was just an early adopter of the concept of logging off. The Hellfire Club wasn't a cult, it was a coping mechanism. As you walk back up the tunnel towards the daylight, the white walls seem to close in. You emerge back into the English countryside. The birds are singing. The cars are driving on the A40 highway. The world is rational, loud, and busy. And you can understand just for a second why they did it, why they wanted to stay in the dark. The Hellfire Club is gone. The wine is drunk. The monks are dead. But the impulse remains. The desire to find a door, open it, and step out of the real world and into the mystery. So the next time you hear a wild conspiracy theory about the secret elites running the world, asking demons for instructions, just remember the Earl of Sandwich and the baboon. The truth is rarely that scary. Usually it's just a bunch of guys in a room trying to make each other laugh because they are afraid of the silence. Thank you for listening to this little journey into the 18th century underground. I hope it was relaxing or at least distracting enough to quiet your own mind for a while. I'm going to head off now. I have some caves of my own to explore, mostly metaphorical ones. Sleep well, and if you see a boat crossing the river at midnight, maybe just look the other way. Good night.